Hey, welcome back to the MMA Vivisection. This is Zane Simon from Bloody Elbow. I'm joined by Victor Rodriguez. And today we are going to cover World Series of Fighting 15. Victor, on a weekend packed full of MMA action, where does this card rank for you?
Oh boy, we're starting with both barrels here, aren't we? It's gonna be tough, man. I mean, you've got the prelims for the UFC event, and then you've got this pretty solid Bellator card that's come together, and then we have World Series of Fighting. And I don't know why they have this habit of picking busy weekends to go against other events, but I really don't know. I think this is probably something that I might not be watching live.
Yeah, it does kind of have the feeling of a DVR it for two or three fights and then come back and then like in the slow points between the Bellator and the UFC event, watch those DVR'd fights.
Yeah, I just want to say, look, it's not. It doesn't seem like a terrible card. There are some of these fights look stylistically interesting, and it does seem to look like it has the promise of having some fun bounce on it. It's what they're going up against. Have this been any other weekend in which maybe they were going up against some sort of boxing event or something that's not as influential or with as many consequences as, for example, the UFC card or the Bellator card. Uh, it's just not an event that seems as relevant outside of maybe the top three fights.
Well, here's a question though. What
Yes,
what do you think will be better, World Series of Fighting undercard or UFC 180 undercard?
probably the UFC 180 card. I I just I don't know. It seems to me like those are guys that have a different degree of experience, and there are some of these
Really?
fights when I was.
The
Yeah,
tough
no, I
Latin
don't know.
American?
For some reason, yeah, I saw Tough Latin America. And I'll tell you something. I wasn't blown away. Some of the fights were downright hideous, but I will say this: there were some pretty fun finishes, and they just have a very different sense of determination. A lot of those guys there really are hungry,
Oh no,
and I don't know.
I don't
There's a
doubt
sense
that.
of that brings a sense of urgency to certain fights when you see these two guys that really want to go at it. That tenacity, and I don't know. I can't really compare that to this card for some reason.
Yeah, I see. For me, I had no interest. I think that the Tough China season, like, and it's not like Tough China failed. Like, oh, I mean, because I realize it's like this developing project down the road, but the development seems now to have failed with the closing of the UFC's Asia office and the sort of pullback from their China goals. Like that part of it seems to have failed. You know, I mean,
Tough China. That's a hell of a road, though, man. That's the Long Island Expressway we're talking about right there. That's a hell of a road you're gonna have to take to get to where the UFC wants in China, though. I mean, I'd argue that it's not. And this is probably something that we talked about previously. I think we did something about this and for one of the Invicta cards, in which you look at the state of boxing in Mexico, where it's the king of sports essentially in terms
yeah.
of anything that's combat related, right? But jiu-jitsu has made inroads in Latin America, and especially from the last 10 years, that you don't have that sort of infrastructure in China. So, these fighters are not as they're not lost on the ground, but it's just not as advanced. And putting the whole game together, that's the element that's really missing, and they don't have that in China. So the talent's going to really be lagging behind. So you look at some of these Mexican fighters; they're definitely further ahead, and again, they have a different approach to that. That's a lot more exciting. So I'd say there's a greater potential for fireworks on any of those undercard fights than there would be for some of these undercard fights.
I'm not seeing it. I'm glad you're optimistic. I like the optimism. I think it's befitting because mine is all pessimism. And it's not even that I think that about like I said, it's not even a direct talent comparison to me. It's just the idea that I don't see the next step for the UFC after Tough. Like I don't see what their next game plan is. It was supposed to be UFC 180, and which is now not going to be half as big a deal as they wanted it to be. And
Right. Yeah. This is very true.
and
The,
so it's this idea of like, so if this doesn't end up being a huge deal, and you say, you and then you realize, and like maybe the socio-political climate changes to the point that you don't want to put on another season of Tough down there. Well, they didn't even put this season of Tough down in Mexico. That was done in Las Vegas, right?
well, yes, but it's still to be shown on Mexican television.
Yeah, yeah.
I
But
don't
I
think
mean,
it's.
if the if you don't feel like you can hold events there with any regularity and establish any talent there without just drawing really raw guys out up to the state gyms, at some point it's like, well, how are you going to advance that market? What's your plan beyond Tough? What are you going to establish? And I don't see them saying like, like the I would have hoped the Tough China thing would be an example where it would have been like Tough China, and then you see like four more steps in a row that all make sense in establishing how you're going to keep developing talent now that you've gotten some tiny micron of a foothold.
Right.
And
Well,
you don't see any of those steps. And so I look at something like Tough Latin America, and I'm saying, okay, even if this works, what are you doing next? Like, how are you going to convince me that you're going to keep developing talent out of this country?
I would actually propose the following. Just from a change of perspective. But before that, a few caveats. Number one, the fact that it was Latin America, obviously, in order to, I guess, maybe because they didn't want to have everybody in Mexico, they had the Mexican fighters versus the
Yeah.
fighters that were from all these other countries. So, I mean, that's probably part of the reason why they had it in Vegas, plus the back-to-back-to-back seasons of Tough that were being filmed. On top of that, and just the whole, that's kind of might play a bit of a factor as to why we shot in the U.S. But also the fact that the main thing that it seems like they're trying to do is develop a degree of consciousness in the mass media in these countries that they're trying to
Hmm.
um, gain some sort of relevancy in, and also the fact that this is more about television revenue. All this, the possibility of scaling back from pay-per-view, and the fact that they're probably their pay-per-view buy rates are down, but they're still getting TV deals. And if you at least say, hey, we're in Mexico, we have this great deal with WSOF, we got a bunch of Mexican fighters, maybe not the biggest Mexican or Mexican American star that you folks would want or that we would have wanted for profitability, but at least we're putting it out there. We like you guys. We want your ad revenue. Let's make this thing happen. And maybe, just maybe, you're going to have some more popularity in MMA gyms, and they can go back 2 or 3 years later and find a bit of advancement. I mean, I think it might be done in the hopes of something along those lines. If
Yeah,
that's
and I,
what
I
you're
mean, I
saying.
think they probably have a better shot at it working than they did with China, just because in the U.S. you're going to keep getting a lot of Mexican American talent coming up that will still
Yeah.
be that you can still put forth to a Mexican audience and say, these are your fighters that you want to watch. Whereas in China, like with China, they can't really do, like, they don't have the ability to do that. It's either you're getting guys straight out of China or what? Like, you're not. I mean, there are obviously there's a large Chinese American population, but they don't seem to have tapped into that as like a talent base in the same way that you're getting a lot of Mexican American guys coming up in the ranks of the UFC.
Yeah, but it's also easier for people, for example, Mexican Americans, to possibly be hired as coaches and go down to Mexico and train. Kind of have maybe a bit of
Yeah.
a talent exchange than it is to have someone go to China. And also the depth of grappling. I'm trying to remember who it was. There was a Chinese fighter that was rumored to have been a jiu-jitsu brown belt or something, and I guess they had some sort of review and they bumped him down to purple. Which is like, okay, so are they? I mean, I know the Chinese are great at bootlegging; they're famous for that. But shit, are they doing this too now with belts? Like, where is this? What kind of
Yeah.
failure is there in along those lines?
It could be a grappling thing, but I honestly just think it. I mean, it, the lack of progress in general with the tough product as a jumping off point, the ability to turn that from a jumping off point into a consistent something that they can keep going back to. It worries me when I see them do tough as like a way to get into a country. But anyway, we're way off topic from World Series.
Yeah, that's fine.
Um, so anyway, World Series of Fighting, we're back. Big change since the last World Series of Fighting show is Steve Carl is no longer a member of the organization. Uh, what he was their champ, right? You
He
know,
was. He defeated Josh Berkman with a major back injury that he probably should
yeah.
not have been fighting through.
Oh no, he's
And
not the champ. Who's Small
no,
Paul Harris is the
right.
champ.
He fought subsequently fought Polaris and lost somewhat predictably by leg lock. The heel hook.
Yeah.
It's a real shame. It's a real shame in his case.
Yeah, still, it's another former champ that's out the door, along with Karkanyan and Berkman. They seem to be shedding guys that have been competitive at the top of their organization, and not because they don't want them fighting there, but because those fighters don't want to fight there. That continues to appear to be a major problem for them.
It's the scheduling of fights for the fighters themselves. It's the fact that they're another problem that we've talked about that continues to persist, where fighters are claiming that they're asked to take bouts on short notice for less money, or there's some sort of disagreement with the pay and all that. Which Ali Abdelaziz back in the Bjorn Revney days used to take Bellator to task for all of the time. He used to harp on them for. I remember actually when it was announced that Bjorn Revney was to be replaced by Scott Coker, he was on the MMA hour with Helwani talking about this is Independence Day, and we've been freed from this man who's being unfair and doing these terrible things for the business and for the sport, and then now you're the guy who's also being accused of not even not paying the guys right, but not even getting them fights at all. But hey, that's none of my business.
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things where I feel a little bit bad for World Series of Fighting because I feel like they started with a bad idea and they are now they've had to keep going with this idea to try to make this bad idea successful, and they're now at the point where the bad idea is obviously never going to work, and they are
Oh God.
they're now it's like, well, what do? We have this bad idea, which was to make a fight promotion based on paying aging veterans well. Like that was the World Series of Fighting platform. Was like, we're going to take guys that have had a name in the sport and give them a platform to get big fights. And that's a terrible idea in MMA. Most
Well,
people,
it's a bit of. I'm sorry.
oh no, I was gonna say most people don't have enough interest in like in the stars of yesterday to watch them.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a combination of factors here, and if you look at this card, it's a pretty good example. It's somewhat top-heavy, and then the rest of the card is filled out with what was something similar to the old Strikeforce formula, or to perhaps this is subject to change the Bellator formula. Look, we're going to have a couple of bigger names here that we're going to fly in from wherever, right? Maybe a few local talents that are pretty famous. And also, aside from that, we're going to fill out the rest of the card with regional talent or guys who are, sort of coming up in the ranks to, keep the local crew and audience happy and sort of make things function that way. I don't think that World Series of Fighting ever intended on being like this is the league of the washed up fighters or anything like that. It's more like, hey, look, if you're a top level fighter and you're not in the UFC
Yeah.
or you're having some sort of a rough patch maybe in your career, this might be a place to come on over and either rebound or stay and do well. It was something maybe more along those lines of like,
Yeah.
let's
Well,
show some love for the veterans and also mix in some of the new guys. But somehow that's gone pretty much off the rails, and they're suffering a bit of an identity crisis. I don't think they know what they want to be at this point.
yeah, I mean, when I'm not trying to say that it's a home for washed up talent, but it's just it's a home for the guys that have had at some point in their career have made a name for themselves and
Right.
do not have a place to get big money fights. Like that was very much the goal. And um like that's an MMA formula that's pretty much a tried and true formula for failure at this point. Like we've seen other organizations try to do this over and over again And I mean, what Musin Fight Gods had like
Oh, yeah, I
one
remember
event.
that. Jeff, yeah, Jeff Monson was on that card. They had oh Jesus, they had Tim
Tim
Sylvia.
Sylvia.
I don't know. Yeah, I think that's the one where he fought Pujanowski for the first time.
Yep. And then there was what was it? There
Yeah.
was that organization down in Southeast Asia where Frank Shamrock and Josh Barnett fought yeah, Mondragon Dos Santos down there, and or Ken Shamrock, not Frank Shamrock, Ken Shamrock.
I I don't remember that organization. No, I haven't. I mean, I remember something about this, but I don't remember what organization it was or how that went.
It
That's how much I really, you know.
let me see here. I'll have it here in just a second. But like these organizations, this is a formula people keep dipping into. Impact FC, that's what it was. Impact
Oh
FC,
wow, yeah, that sounds familiar. Yeah.
and where Ken Shamrock fought Pedro Hizzo back in 2010. And Josh Barnett, Guillermo or Geronimo dos Santos, Sokaju, Carlos Newton fought Brian Ebersol. It just
Oh wow, that's where Ebersol fought Newton. Okay, yeah, okay,
yeah,
I do remember hearing about this.
this is it's a formula that we keep seeing, and it keeps not working for anyone. And World Series of Fighting's made a pretty good run at it. They're at 15 events now, but it feels like every single event they get slightly further away from that initial idea.
Yeah, I gotta say, this shows to me that looking at the state of World Series of Fighting, I just have more and more respect for all of his misgivings. You can't say that Bjorn Redney was a schmuck. You know, in terms of being able to make something, get something small and make it moderately sized and then somewhat larger to be able to sell off to Viacom the way he did, that's pretty impressive because it's a hard game. You
Yeah,
know, playing small ball and then mixing in the veterans and doing things like that the way he did it, despite all the problems that they had and despite all the shenanigans that the accusations that were eventually floating around, you got to give him that. You got to give him his props. You can't look if you cannot be intellectually honest. If you're able to praise Scott Coker for doing what he did with Strikeforce, with very few resources, and now look at Redney and say the same thing. I'm looking at World Series of Fighting, and it seems like they've only got one major backer. And I don't know. Again, I'm going to say this every single time. How much more money is Sig Rogic willing to throw into the furnace here with these guys? Because it doesn't. I don't see how this could be profitable. I'll say this too. That last event in Canada that they had was surprisingly fun. It wasn't
yeah.
the best event, certainly, but it was all right. It was as a TV product, it seemed cool, and it seemed like it was fun to be in the audience for that one. I don't
Oh
know.
yeah. I'm not like saying, that's the thing is it's not necessarily about what the product ends up being on TV because the product with MMA, especially when you're tapping into lower level regional guys, the product could be anything. You can take 30 good or 20 or 30 good fighters, stick them together and make one of the worst cards that anybody's ever watched, or you can take
Mm,
30 regional scrappy nobodies and stick them together and make one of the best cards anybody's ever watched. Like the
true.
eventual product is that's lightning in a bottle. It's just the consistency with which you can deliver things that people want to watch and get people to pay for it or show up for it or back it and
Yeah.
fund it. And that seems to be where World Series of Fighting is having their problems.
Well, if they keep doing this, as far as going on these busy weekends, it's going to continue to be a problem. Last time it was the UFC Brazil event. They went up against some Mayweather events. I think it was that same night. They can't keep doing this. So what are they trying to do? Is this intentionally trying to tank the ratings, going up against bigger events? It doesn't make any sense to
Yeah. So all that, on that down note, let's start looking at the card.
me. And I'm
So
the optimist here.
So going in, like we're working off Tapology here because it seems that the bout order and who's on it has changed a bit, and what's on Sherdog doesn't look that right at the moment. As trustable as they usually are. But so first up on World Series of Fighting, Tapology has Josh Zuckerman versus Matt Frivola. Is this anything you know about this matchup at all?
Here's the problem. Unfortunately, this was one of those bouts that is to replace one of the canceled bouts. So
Okay, so then
unfortunately, these first two bouts were kind of slapped together last minute, essentially, and I wasn't really. I don't. I've seen actually some footage of Zuckerman before. I don't know as much about his opponent, and this is going to be one of those lightweight bouts that's I really can't say that much except for Zuckerman having pretty basic boxing and being able to work around. So this will just be another fight for him to get some experience under his belt.
all right, yeah, no shame in if you don't know anything about any of these undercards bouts, don't worry about it. This is not these are not fights to know or to watch. The same with Steven Esquivel, Christian Reed. We're skipping that. All right, so Reggie Pena, Joe Johnson, middleweight bout. What do you know?
Okay, this was the first fight. I was doing relatively okay when I was doing my notes for this in order to do the prep work, except until I hit this snag. And this is the one that made me want to just like flip the table over because I don't understand how the Florida State Athletic Commission is going to allow this to happen. We're almost at the running man days of our civilization with this. Reggie Pena is a guy who's been he's fought at a couple of weight classes before, right? But he's fighting Joe Johnson, he has a record of 3 wins and 7 losses. All right, the guy is 49 years old, and he's going to fight a guy who's like what, 30, 32, something like that. I don't see this going well for Johnson at all. The guy, he's built, very well for a guy his age. He seems like he's been an athlete his whole life. He just doesn't seem to. I don't know. He's just got his basic boxing, and he seems tentative, and he's his takedown defense isn't where it needs to be. He has a win by Kimura, which I didn't get to see. I don't know how he was able to slap that on because he doesn't seem like he's very submission savvy. But this is not going to be something that you're going to watch and feel comfortable with the results. It's going to be one of those. I don't know if you've ever seen a kid, if you've ever actually witnessed a kid watching his dad get beat up. You're going to get that feeling here. It's not.
Oh, that's. See, you're supposed to be the optimist.
I am, but I'm also a realist, and that's where this is. See, this is where you get things twisted. Simon. I'm keeping it real in a sheer constant tailspin. All right, yes, Disney afternoon references, Darkwing Duck represent. This is not the way this is gonna. No. I can't be. I can be an optimist to a point. Ben is 10-6. All right. He's had his all-pro career. He's got some submissions in there, including 2 triangle chokes, which always impressive to do in MMA, right? He's lost to Ricky Rainey, Bellator veteran. He lost to Ben Saunders, also very famously a UFC and Bellator veteran as well. He fought UFC veteran Matt Arroyo in a loss. But, he seems like a stable guy. 10-6 is not a record to be ashamed of. But, come on, man, 49, and you're 3-6. And he only started in 2010. So, what?
That's got to be. You got to think that that's like a local guy that they know that people are going to show up for, and that's why he's on the card. Somebody who's maybe owns a local gym or is got some fan support in the community or something like that. Because otherwise, it's a weird bout for even for World Series of Fighting. Like that's a low level regional kind of booking. So,
yeah, we had the last card. We had a guy who fought once like 10 years ago, took a 10-year break from MMA, and came back. That's far more passable than this. Let's be real.
Yeah. All right. Moving on. Hector Ochoa, Robert Reed.
Yes, this I feel a little more. I feel actually a lot better about talking about this one. Now we got that out of the way. Ochoa, he's 3-0 as an amateur, 2-0 as a pro. He's actually, no, I'm sorry. He's 2-2 as a pro. Both losses, interestingly enough, were by omoplata, which, that's not something that you see very often.
That's good, actually. That's not a good thing to lose by one of the rarest and hardest to hit submissions in MMA
Yeah.
twice.
Yes. I mean, if it was wearing a gi, I could see it happening a lot easier, but no. His boxing seems pretty basic. He just has very rudimentary striking, but he seems very content to smash guys in the guard. You know what I mean? He'll stay in the guy's guard and smash him, or if he's using his guard, he's mostly going to be using that for striking. Not necessarily a bad thing. He's very aggressive, and he seems he hits pretty hard. He's going in there against Robert Reed, who's 1-0 as an amateur, 1-0 as a pro. He hits very, very, very hard. He seems to depend more on working his way out of submissions and bad positions through pure power and physicality. Not very good on the ground, so I'm going to guess that this was booked in the hopes of this being a very standing heavy fight. And there's no problem with that. I'm looking forward to that. That's not bad at all.
No, no, that's exactly what you want out of your undercards. You want a lot of action, you know. Uh, so next up, Tony Way, Federico Moncayo.
Yeah. Oh, man. Tony, whose nickname is The Only, yes.
Yes,
Tony The Only Way, yes.
that's great. I'm a
Wow.
fan.
Hey, man, if your nickname sounds like something out of an 80s soundtrack, hey, you gotta get it while you can, I suppose. He's, he's 2-4 as a professional, with one no contest. Um, I don't know what that says in its.
Is that what you're saying? We're not watching the next Johnny Hendricks here?
Well, hey, look, man, 2-4, you can still turn it around.
Yeah.
Realistically, you can. So, I don't think it's not some sort of. It's not an anchor around his neck or anything like that. He likes very flashy high kicks, and he's very. He seems to want to do very dynamic things, and he likes working body shots, not lazy ones either. So that's pretty good. He's training out of that same crew that trains with Ultimate Fighter contestant Shane Prim, as well as Stephanie Egginton, who's just fought for the Invicta title. So, he's going to be something that you'd want to at least watch from an action standpoint. Who knows? He might be able to improve his record. Moncayo, 8-0 as an amateur and 1-1 as a pro. His only submission win being a rear naked choke. He seems like he's one of those guys who's he's very active in scrambles, and he's also pretty smart about his positioning. So if this goes to the ground, that'll be good to watch. Otherwise, in terms of stand-up, I think Tony got a pretty big advantage.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I'm always interested in the guys that do really well grappling on the regional circuit, just because I think it doesn't like it usually doesn't transfer that well to when you start to get to a more elite level. Like, as much as I'd like it to, it's easier to be a cut above the average grappler regionally. So I'm always interested to see, how do those guys actually, like, how are they better submission artists than their regional counterparts? Because very rarely do you see a guy who's just a submission wizard regionally get up to like a UFC or Bellator level and then still be like just totally wrenching guys' arms all over the place.
Well, I mean, you do see, it's probably easier to do with striking, although we do see guys that hit a bit of a snag, like their first 4 or 5 fights, they're just knocking guys out, but then they end up fighting guys that are harder to put away. So, but with grappling, it's probably more difficult because of the state of grappling now in general, inside and outside of MMA. So, yeah.
All right, next up we've got Jose Cortez and Ryan Keenan.
Yeah. Okay. So he's wow. I mean, he's a boxing and jiu-jitsu guy. He's not the wrestle boxer. He's a jiu-jitsu boxer type guy. Doesn't have that much of a transition game. He's either doing one or the other. It's not very smooth for him to shift into from one to the next. What is he? He's 4-7, I believe, as an amateur. Is that the record that I was saying there? And not bad. Again, growing, trying to get his game together, and he's going up against 5-2 Ryan Keenan, who's got 3 TKOs and 2 submissions. All wins by finish. that's always a good sign. I mean, he's always hunting for it. He's always looking for a submission. Takedown defense is serviceable. He's got pretty basic boxing, and again, this seems like it's going to be interesting. And Ryan Keenan's nickname, who dat? That's like the most Florida thing ever. Like, yeah, who dat? Oh, okay, yeah.
Who dat ninja?
Who dat? Yeah. Where they at, though?
All right. Okay, so nicknames aside, I assume you're picking Keenan to win this fight.
That's a little tricky. I say the odds probably favor him. For all of you degenerate gamblers out there, we like you. We really do. But I'm not very hip to the odds as to how this would go.
I'll be posting, the odds are up for the main card fights. They're not.
Okay.
There are no odds to be undercard. So.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I'm just saying in general, I don't really look at the odds or anything like that. But it seems to me, just based on what I've seen from both of those guys, Keenan certainly seems to have a bit of an advantage, but we might see an upset. You never know.
All right, finally, featherweight bout. Well, we got two more, but one of which has changed since you looked at it. And
right.
So next up, though, featherweight bout: Anderson Hutchinson, Troy Gerhardt.
Yeah, Hutchinson, seems like a very wrestling-heavy guy. He's 9-0 as an amateur, 3-0 as a professional, which is pretty good when you have that kind of seasoning and pedigree at an amateur level. I'm very happy to see that we're seeing more of that now these days, especially on these smaller shows or smaller promotions. He strikes it. He uses a lot of his striking to get into the clinch and start working the takedown from there. He's one of those guys. Still somewhat cautious. He's another one of those guys who's trying to work phases and integrating his game to be a lot more have less risks in it. He's either really dominant or he's really not in some stretches of fights. But when he is actually taking control, he's really on point. He's taking on Gerhardt, who's all his fights are professional bouts at 6-3, 1 KO win. He's got losses. Actually, both of them I think have lost to Luis Palomino, World Series of Fighting guy himself. He's lost to Palomino, Patrick Sanoble, who we saw in the UFC. Hits really hard. Really good at finishing guys. Really, his instincts are really sharp, and it's one of those things you can't really teach. So. Yeah, we're going to see where this takes it. I would probably have to side with Gerhardt here, although Hutchinson's going to be pretty hard to put away.
Yeah, well, there's no shame in losing to Luis Palomino, especially not in your first 10 fights as a pro.
No, definitely. This is true.
All right, and finally, Maurice Salmon getting a late notice replacement against Javier Torres. What do you know about Salmon, at the very least?
Well, Salmon, 3-3 as a pro. He's one of the Gracie Barra guys out of South Jacksonville. 2 TKOs, and including one knockout that came in around 8 seconds, which is great. Another guy who's a jiu-jitsu boxer. He seems to be putting his thing together, and very aggressive with his submission game. Very good with scrambles, and very good as far as ground movement and taking the shots when he's striking on the ground. So, don't know that much about Torres, but it could be a very regrettable night for him if he doesn't mind his P's and Q's on that end. Although Salmon is 39 years old, not sure how this is going to go in terms of that, and what kind of shape he's going to be in, how the change in opponent is going to affect him.
Yeah, well, usually the guy coming in on late notice is the one who's really hurt by that. I mean, especially in a regional show where it's not like the UFC where you're getting in, hopefully getting in somebody on late notice who was at least training for another fight or was in the gym and in camp. On a regional show, when you're getting a late notice guy, I mean, you don't know. You're getting somebody who was in the gym and happened to be on weight that day,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, whoever could cut weight the fastest to make it to that point, yes.
All right, so now we're going to start getting into the card that, it actually holds some interest and that we actually have odds on and that, you should actually consider tuning in for, like we said, DVRing and watching some of these fights in between Bellator and perhaps UFC 180 undercard if you're like Vic and figure that that's going to be high value. But first up, we have George Patino, the ever-living creature of MMA, and
Uh,
he's taking on Eric Reynolds in a lightweight bout. And the fight odds for this, Patino is a slight underdog, and Reynolds is a slight favorite. And I'm kind of feeling that. I feel that Patino may be finally falling off that cliff just a little. I mean, I know he's just a little over the hill, past the prime of his career, maybe. What do you think? What are your thoughts here? Do you think
I don't
George
know about
Patino's
that.
been, he,
Look,
I
man,
think he's been
I like what him, but he's getting up there a little in age. He's definitely going to be at a size disadvantage. He does have that these fits where he gets these flurries. You know, he comes in and he just
yeah.
lunges and he comes in pretty fast, so he might have a speed advantage there. I don't know, man. I mean, Reynolds is a tough dude, but Patino's just I can't bring myself to pick against him in this. At the same time, I really don't know what kind of chances he'd have. I'd say that's probably something that I'd probably put money on Patino right there, just from this whole thing. He's beaten and fought better opposition. I don't know, man. I figure this is maybe the Eric Reynolds puzzle is one that he can solve, and it's not going to be as. I'm not sure how Reynolds actually ended up being the favorite. I mean, he hits hard. He's certainly a lanky dude and all that, but just don't see it.
And for fans that don't know, we say this about Patino. He's 41 and he started fighting in 1995.
Yeah.
1995.
Yeah.
And even as of this, as of a year ago, took one of the better Japanese prospects on the market, Isao Kobayashi, to a draw, and beat Efrain Escudero, who the UFC then decided to turn right back around and bring into the UFC again. His only two losses recently are to Carlos Diego Ferreira, UFC fighter, who's done pretty well for himself so far, and Luis Palomino, who is a likewise aged vet with just a little more dynamism in the tank, a few, more fun one-off strikes. So, Macaco is really sort of one of these rarities in MMA of just a guy who seems tougher than shit and is impossible to count out of a fight at any point. He's sort of he's sort of the next incarnation of Dan Severn,
Probably, which is even more impressive when you consider that he's been fighting at lower weight classes.
Yeah.
So I mean that seems the weight cuts and everything that all takes a toll, man. I mean this is just such a strange. He's fought everywhere. He fought Miletich in the UFC. He fought Misaki in Pride. I mean he's fought a bunch of guys that Casey Usola, we might remember, probably not that certainly not that big a name, but then he fought Andre Galvao when he was doing MMA. He beat Mike Bronzulis. He beat Pete Spratt. I mean he's not a pushover by any means, and this is probably one of those things that and this is probably something that we should give World Series of Credit World Series of Fighting a degree of credit for, that they do at every single event. I find there's this interesting matchup where you go, okay, I'm interested in seeing this fight, but what's going to happen next? It's similar to the conversation we had last time regarding Ford and Shields. Where does Shields go if he loses? What's going to happen to Ryan Ford if he wins? And you end up with this sort of sense of intrigue of what it means for someone's career. Like the next event, which I'm sure we're probably going to get to, John Fitch versus Husimar Palhares. What does a win or a loss mean for either one of these guys? It's one of those things here, and I mean, probably to a smaller scale here with Patino and Reynolds. I mean, obviously Patino seems to be slowing down, and Reynolds is pretty much in the middle there, or also maybe towards the end of his career. So it's really interesting to see what's going to happen and what they look like here. I don't know, man. I can't. Again, I really can't bring myself to pick against what here. He just seems like the guy with the veteran savvy that might be able to really pull something out.
Yeah, he's a tough guy to pick against. Like I'm not. I'm picking. I would take Reynolds here, but not because I'm like sure that Reynolds is just gonna stomp him.
Yeah, no, I mean, just in terms of money, yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah.
That's perfectly fine.
So next up, we've got one of the few strawweight fights taking place outside of Invicta or the UFC right now at a high level. There just aren't that many of these women fighting that have not signed with that or with one of those two organizations. It's Kalindra Faria versus Jessica Aguilar for the strawweight title. Aguilar being the title holder, being the sort of circumspect at this point #1 strawweight in the world. I'm not entirely sold on that whole thing at this point.
Oh, I don't know. I think it has. Okay, you do make a good point. It is somewhat suspect, especially now that we're having the strawweight season of Tough and all these other fighters, a bunch of them which she has fought and she has defeated. That's likely going to change. I don't think it's going to be a marketing point that is going to be that they can use for very long, because once these other fighters are in the UFC at her weight class and they start fighting better competition more consistently, that's going to be a thing. Let me ask you this though, and I don't know if you've seen anything about this yet. Last I heard about this was last night. Do you think this fight is actually going to take place?
I actually don't know anything. I don't know about that. You're
Okay,
throwing a curveball at me.
I'm sorry. Okay, perhaps a little background here. Kalindra Faria was still, as of last night, as of Thursday, was still grounded in Brazil because of passport and visa issues. She was hoping to be able to make it on an overnight flight that would arrive in Florida somewhere around 9 in the morning today, right, in order to make the weigh-ins at 2:30. So she's got to get her paperwork and all her shit sorted out, be able to take the flight, be able to arrive in Florida and still make weight in order to make this a title fight.
Huh.
World Series of Fighting.
That does not sound to me like a fight that is going to happen.
I mean, even if it does, it'll probably, maybe, if she doesn't make weight, it's going to have to end up as a non-title fight. And then what happens then? I mean, I don't know. Is it going to be a fight you're going to want to see? As far as you're going to be depleted?
It looks like she will make it. I mean, she says it looks like she'll make it to the U.S. She says that she's got a ticket for, this was yesterday, for 11 p.m. And that she's cutting weight, before she's traveling and while she's on the plane, to the best of her ability. So I would
cutting weight and.
I assume she'll make it to the U.S., but at this point, okay. First of all, so the odds: Jessica Aguilar is a favorite, 350 to 320. Faria is coming in underdog, 260 to 273. And at this point, those odds are probably off, and I would bookmark this as more of a 5 to 700 situation where there's almost no way that Aguilar loses to a fighter flying in the day of the fight or the day before the fight and cutting weight while traveling.
You imagine how bad it must suck to cut weight at an airport. I mean, most airports have terrible food to begin with, so you're probably going to be a little hesitant to try anything, but come on, man. This is one of those things. Again, I don't know if this really falls on the promotion or on her. I mean, you'd think that she would have, this is her first fight outside of Brazil, isn't it?
Yeah.
You think that she'd probably, maybe, I don't know, get her thing together. She trains with other really high-level guys that have fought elsewhere and outside of Brazil. I mean, you kind of know that you got to get your shit together ahead of time.
this is on her and her management. I mean, if she arrived
Yeah.
at the airport and her visa was denied, that's on her. Like that's on her and her management to say to not have researched exactly what she needed and to not have that that whole process smoothed out
Yeah.
to and down to like an exact thing. There's no reason that you should be showing up to the airport and finding out you can't fly. Like that's ridiculous.
Yeah. This is one of those things, man. It makes every single one of these events has this bizarro element to it. It's at least one or two things that go, why is this happening? But hey, what are you gonna do? I mean, it happens. It happens in any organization, regardless of status. These are things that are gonna happen in the fight game. Unfortunately, I just
Yeah.
really wish they'd gotten it together. And I was looking forward to this bout, man. I really was, because first it was the deal with whether or not she was going to be able to fight since she is signed or was signed to XFC, and then there were some sort of contractual disagreement on whether or not she was going to be allowed to fight for another organization. And then she's fighting Aguilar, who has pretty much been there and done that. I mean, she fought Megumi Fuji once, or she beat her once by decision in what was a bit of a controversial bout. The second fight, I'm not really going to count it because it was an injury that forced a doctor stoppage. I mean, you never know if that could have turned around. She's been, what is it? She's 2-1 against Angela Magana. She lost to Karina Dam and Soda Frausto earlier in her career. No shame in either one of those when you're fighting early on. She's fought as far as Lisa Ellis, who she's 1-1 against. Patricia Vodonik twice. Alita Gray, who was her first World Series of Fighting opponent, and in her last bout she fought Emi Fujino. She's fought very good opposition. I don't
Yep.
know if Faria has. She hasn't really fought that level of opposition in one. You look at the people she's fought. I mean, she's what, 15-3, right? Okay, she's got losses to Claudia Gaviria, no shame. Vanessa Porto, again, no shame. Karina Dam, who she's 1-1 against, and then a draw against Jennifer Maya. But those are the only high level or sort of higher level fighters that she's fought. Everyone else, who did she actually beat outside of Sanya Susovic, the famous for her stint in Super Fight League? I don't see how that translates. I don't see how they're.
Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, like, when you're talking about women's MMA and you're talking outside Invicta and the UFC, you're literally trying to find anyone who's consistently winning fights to get in a big
Yeah.
fight.
Okay, well, here's my question. What does this really do for Aguilar outside of burning up the fights on her contract? I mean, she's wanted
There's
to
no
do.
fight that Aguilar could have in her career right now that's not in Invicta or the UFC that does anything for Jessica Aguilar. Like that fight
That's
doesn't
gonna.
exist. There's
Yeah.
not one person in the world that she could fight. Even if she even if some great like I mean Kalinda Faria is certainly like the most legit contender she can face.
Yeah.
Um, and even that does nothing for her. Like even if she's facing super legit competition, nobody wants to see a World Series of Fighting title holder for the women's division. Like nobody, that's not something anybody cares about.
Yeah,
It's,
I mean, I feel kind of bad because Aguilar is a very talented. She's really been one of the more talented fighters, and it's a shame that she didn't end up in any way either under Invicta or the UFC. If this isn't like Josh Berkman who lost his welterweight title and he was able to leave, like this, she is the women's division. What I mean? Like there is no other women's weight class in World Series of Fighting. She is the sole representation of women in that company. And I mean, she talked about how she wanted to fight often, and maybe in hopes of burning out her contract and going elsewhere. I don't know, or maybe because she just wants to stay busy. I really feel bad that she's essentially sort of trapped, and the fact that she's going to be losing that pound for pound status pretty quick. Although it doesn't really, I mean, not pound for pound, but like with
yeah,
number one within her weight class, it's problematic.
yeah, and unfortunately for her, it's a case of going from the exact one situation that was really bad to the exact same situation under the hope that it would be totally different. Bellator was doing the exact same thing with her, and now she's in the same situation with World Series of Fighting, and it's I think it's the danger that fighters can encounter when they go for a contract that looks like it will pay them more for an organization that is not well established. You know, that's the
Right.
danger I see.
Well, I mean, the landscape changed too, because at least she was able to fight Megumi Fuji and Bellator. And I mean, at that point in time, sure, she was on the downside of her career, but she was a very legitimate opponent that you know, it would have made more sense. But that sort of dried up now. The way that the landscape of the sport has changed, especially for that weight class, and you're absolutely right. There's not really anybody else right now that she can fight that's going to be boosting her profile anytime soon, unless it's like some sort of highlight reel finishes, in which case people are going to look at that and go, yeah, that was kind of supposed to happen.
Yeah, I mean it's unfortunate. You got to feel bad for Aguilar, but it's also I think it highlights maybe a story of caution for women's MMA, that there are a lot of organizations that are looking to align themselves with and sign up a woman fighter for as a main attraction,
Mm-hmm.
who then cannot actually provide that fighter enough support to make them a career,
Yeah,
or to make
I
them a
mean,
career that anybody cares about long term.
yeah,
And
yeah. I mean, I really hope that. I'm sorry.
oh no, go ahead.
No. I mean, it's someone who's as talented as her. I just really would hope that somehow they either scrap that division and let her go, or, I mean, it's not likely to happen. But I mean, really, how much is this really going to work out? This experiment, essentially, is having her as this whole standard bearer in their company. I don't know how this is going to really happen.
Yeah, we'll see. It's kind of a depressing way to talk about her fight, but whatever. Um,
Well,
that kind of depressing.
it's the problem isn't so much, look, under any other circumstances, look, I'd be far more excited for it, but given that all the stuff that's going on around it and given her situation, I really want things to work out for her. I really wish that she were in a better situation. And now she's fighting an opponent who's, have all these problems. It's just sad. The problem isn't her, it's everything
No.
around it. Yeah.
All right, so now co-main event, a fight that I think we can be unashamedly excited for. Justin Gaethje, Melvin Gillard. Gaethje is coming in as a fairly decent favorite here, not a slight favorite, a fairly decent one, at minus 195 to minus 190. Melvin Gillard as the underdog at plus 160 to plus 165. So, what do you think? Gillard, A-level fighter in a B-level organization?
Oh God. Oh man, the amount of shit talking I've heard this week has been fantastic, because it's like one thing after another. Look, Gillard, yes, A-level fighter, but guess what? Justin Gaethje, also A-level fighter. Here's the problem with that. There seems to be. You remember what I said earlier about World Series of Fighting having a bit of an identity problem? This is kind of what's going on here. When you look at the hierarchy of MMA, yes, World Series of Fighting can be categorized as a B-level organization. And there's no real shame in that, because there's only one real A-level right now.
Yeah.
That's not a problem, okay? The fact that there is a massive gulf between, say, number 1, number 2, and number 3, respectively, and you can probably argue that World Series of Fighting might not be the number 3 promotion right now, but fine. Taking that into account, I'm pretty sure that Melvin didn't mean to put them down as a company, but Ali Abdelaziz seems to have taken it that way, and now they've got this back and forth going on. This is not a good look for anyone, and especially not. I got to question how Ali Abdelaziz ended up doing this. I mean, you figure that a guy who's a manager for fighters and understands the struggle of the fighter and the management would think, okay, well, now that this fighters will look at that and go, now that that guy is also a matchmaker and promoter, maybe he'll do right by these fighters, and maybe he'll know how to talk to people or how to handle certain things from a PR perspective. And now you got him and Melvin Gillard pretty much, throwing things at each other. This is not a good look for anyone. And this fight, I'll tell you, Gillard, he's an excellent fighter. He's talented, man. He's just incredibly talented. But his fight IQ is not where it's ever needed to be outside of that 5-fight streak, I think it was, back in the UFC. Which I thought at that point, I'm like, you know what? By this time next year, Melvin's going to be fighting for a title. And then he fought Joe Lozon. Like, oh, okay, that happened. I would see that, you know what, I'd say that the odds makers are correct on this one. I think Gaethje he's strong. He's just improving, not getting enough credit for improving as much as he does between one fight and the next. And, man, I don't know. I don't know what Melvin Gillard is going to show up. Is it going to be the guy who just fought Galagante, or is it going to be the guy who, just has a brain fart? Or, I mean, you never know. You really just don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we're at the point that the young assassin is no longer that young. I mean, and not just like, he's 31 and that's not that old, but we're talking a guy who's been fighting since 2002.
Since he was 16. Yeah.
Yeah, since he was 16.
Actually, yes, because he was doing boxing and kickboxing before.
Yeah.
So he's been fight years,
Yeah, that kind of career, like, it's just not. At some point, you start to slow down. You start to lose a step. And Giard has got he's got a pretty high athletic peak to slow down from. There's nobody doubting that. So I don't expect this bout to be uncompetitive. But he's never had the best chin in the world. It's not terrible, but it's hittable, and he has the ability to be put on roller skates, to be over aggressive and overconfident, and mostly he seems like a guy who fights on instinct, who he sees the opening, he'll take the opening, whether it puts himself in more danger or whether it means committing a blatant foul or whether it whatever. Like, his body is running ahead of his brain by a couple steps. And Gaethje is a classic, hyper dangerous fighter to be doing that against, because he's a constant, aggressive, powerful pressure fighter.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of guys. And he's young enough to still have a great chin. If he didn't, I would say that Giard could catch him quick and early and knock him out, and he'd have a really good puncher's chance. But against a guy who's young and everything's still, strong, and his chin's still good and all that, I just don't see Giard landing that big punch early enough to not get caught in return.
At this point, I would actually, first off, give a shout out to Conor Rubish, who is still doing really, really good work, because I'm kicking myself now. I was going to actually ask him a few days ago what he thought about Melvin Gillard in terms of his striking defense in general. I'd have to probably wonder, he's one of those guys that maybe his chin isn't so much the problem as it is the fact that he's not that good at protecting it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of it. Maybe, some guys put themselves in positions where their body's going one way, they get in the way of a punch, and then anybody could go out. So I have to wonder if maybe that's also part of the thing with Melvin, although I like the way you phrased it, that his body is going further ahead of his brain. It's very serviceable, and it'll get the job done for a certain period of time and against a certain kind of opponent. But I don't see that happening against a guy who's as calculating as Gaethje, and who's taking such great instruction. Because, I mean, you see the way he trains with Trevor Whitman, and you hear Whitman giving him instructions as he's fighting. He's sharp, man. He's on top of it. So I don't know. I don't know how this is. I don't see many avenues for Melvin to win, where I see Gaethje being able to submit him. I see him being able to, throw one of those sneaky body kicks, head kick type combos or something. I don't see how Melvin actually would take this.
Yeah, it's a tough matchup, and it's one that I expect it will be a hell of a lot of fun to watch. I mean, that's the real key here, is that Gaethje is aggressive enough and powerful enough, and Melvin Giard is athletic enough and powerful enough, and that both guys really like to strike, so that no matter what, we're practically guaranteed to get a fun fight.
Yeah, Melvin better win though, because I'll tell you what, if he doesn't, and he starts, after all this A and B and all this other chatter, it's going to be one of those things where you're like, hey, you just lost to a B League guy. What does that make you, Melvin? It's going to be pretty terrible for his ego at that point. But hey, who knows? He might be able to pick himself up. He's working at ATT. We might change shit around.
Yeah, and fighters oftentimes, they have that attitude where like no matter what they've said, the past is the past, and like anything can be sort of like reframed as like, oh well,
Yeah,
I got caught, but
yeah,
you got lucky, and I
yeah,
he didn't get to see the real me and all that, and I'm showing up better
yeah,
next. I
yeah,
mean, you never know. Like
yeah.
I wouldn't worry about Melvin Gillard's ego. He's been fighting long enough that it's probably everything probably works just the way it needs to.
I
But
don't know if there's any other sport. I don't know if there's any other sport that allows you to retcon as much of your abilities and reality than MMA, man. It's weird, but you're right. I don't think that happens any often in any other sport. I hadn't thought about that.
yeah, it's a pretty it offers a lot of twisted rationale. So finally, then we get to our main event, which is almost guaranteed to not be an exciting fight. Yushin Okami versus Dave Branch. Okami coming in as the very large favorite, minus 450 to minus 420. Branch at plus 330 to plus 348. Um, I don't necessarily disagree with those odds, but I also don't necessarily see this fight getting finished. So we're in for probably a pretty uh, lackluster 3 round or 5 round grind. Wouldn't you say?
I gotta disagree with you there, dude. I think they're very well. Number one, I think those odds might be good enough to put some money on Branch, and number two, I think we might actually see him submit Okami. It sounds crazy, but I think it's possible. I don't think that this is going to be fireworks necessarily, but it will be fun in the grappling department, especially with Okami's wrestling and Branch, the improvement that he's done with his grappling.
See,
How likely that the likelihood is going to be low, but
yeah, I just see, you talk about Okami's wrestling and Branch's grappling, and I just see Okami using his size in wrestling to shut Branch's grappling down, and then there's your fight. Like 5 rounds of a controlling wrestler shutting down a grappler who may be improving and may have some nifty submissions, but is not like an explosive grappling threat. You know?
no, no. This is also very likely. I mean, we might end up, in fact, what happens in a lot of these strong grappler versus strong grappler type bouts, where we get instead an ugly kickboxing match. We can end up with that. And I'm not I'm not terribly unrealistic to that level. I mean, that's more likely of what we're going to see, either that or a lot of making Branch carry his weight, a lot of clinch work against the cage, and just knees and stomps. But either way, I do look forward to the grappling. I don't look forward as much to the striking because outside of his jab, Okami doesn't seem to have much variance or anything really that threatening to put Branch on notice. So I don't know. That's really, I don't know. I'm more optimistic about Branch's chances than perhaps I
All
should.
right. Well, I'll take that for what it's worth. Eh, Before we, wrap up here, though, I gotta ask: are you at all concerned about the idea of 3 title fights in a row for people who might just be planning on sitting down and watching this first and foremost as their MMA fix? If
Uh,
if Aguilar Faria ends up being a grind, and let's not pretend that Aguilar is a particularly exciting fighter.
well, she is to me because of like her pressure. I don't know. I kind of admire like her technical ability, but I'm a weirdo. I understand that the common fan probably, or more. Not many people enjoys the same things that I do in a fight. But you are right that she does. She doesn't always fight very pretty. It's not a very It's not a very fan friendly style
Yeah.
for a lot of
I
people.
mean, she likes to
So
establish grappling control and then keep it. That's been most of the heart of Aguilar's fight game is let me get a controlling position and then I'm going to keep that controlling position and work it. And
yeah,
maybe try to work for submission if you really give me one. But she's not the kind of fighter that is going to be like knee bar to heel hook, trend to sweep to something else. I don't know. I don't know how you grappling people work. But if, if the Aguilar Feria fight and the Branch Okami fight both end up being grinds, that Gaethje guard fight better be like 2 or 3 rounds of action. Because if it's over in like 40 seconds and then we're off to the next grind, that's going to be a rough stretch for this World Series of Fighting card.
it's going to be a rough stretch regardless because you have to remember something. Let's assume that the Gaethje Gillard fight ends in less than 2 rounds, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
still going to have Branch versus Okami at the top, and if that turns into the drag fest that it's very statistically likely to be, it's still going to be a long night because you got 5 rounds of that you got to
Yep.
eat. On top of the fact that in this hypothetical scenario, Aguilar is also putting another 5 round drag against Kalin Jafari. So it's going to be exhausting to watch. This is one of those things that if you're not really you really better hope that there isn't much stalling and that the grappling is effective
Yeah.
and putting pressure. But it doesn't seem like it's going to go in that direction because of the stylistic clashes. So I really don't know. I just say arm yourself with a lot of patience and make sure that you have a happy companion like this guy
Or
watching and to keep you, a little animated. Because otherwise, one last thing, and I'm sorry, but the pacing on some of these cards in terms of commercials is pretty dreadful. They're going to start stuffing commercials in there, between bouts. That's another thing too. It's going to make this a bit of a slog. I'm sorry.
well, no, I think honestly, if we're being real here, even though we're doing a video for this card, DVR it, cut it into your other MMA watching, because it's very likely to be the kind of thing where you could go and you'll want to like pick up little bits of it, see how a fight goes. But I would not, of all the things you can watch in MMA, probably the thing that I would turn on first and foremost this weekend is the Bellator card. That is honestly where I would be looking to put my TV focus time, and then I would be cutting it in with this, and then once the Bellator card's over, switching to the UFC event. Honestly, that's what I would say will give you the best viewing experience this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, and going back to what we said previously, it's the problem isn't so much this card; it's the fact that you're going up against these other events that, number one, seem to have more promise overall, and number two, have more significance and importance. I mean, that's not to say that the World Series of Fighting isn't important, but it's not the same, man. It's not going to have the same ramifications as these other events, and that's a real shame against going up against the number one and number two promotion for no reason. They could have done this next week. What do you got next week? What? Metamoris? I mean, come on, man. They could have done this some
Well,
other time.
what's tonight? Is there anything on tonight at all?
There you go. There you go. What is it? Probably an access card, maybe. I mean, they could have done some shit like that, but they didn't. And why? In the name of what? What kind of massive ratings are you expecting to get? It's like they keep crouching behind these. Hey, we have MMA too. Like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't understand any of this as far as attracting an audience. And it's a shame more than anything else. When World Series of Fighting was announced, when it was brought up in the first few events, like, man, I want these guys to succeed. I want these guys to do well because they're doing something that's pretty good. They're giving a bit of a niche to fighters that would need it. But it's hard to tell what they're even trying to accomplish anymore. I think that's the root of my frustration. It's like Frank Shamrock. I want you to stop saying terrible things because I really want to like you. And that's what's going on here. I want these guys to do better because, God, these fighters deserve better. I mean, shit. What advancement is there really going to be on a card that no one's watching?
On that note, I think it's time for us to wrap it up. Thanks for watching. You can find me at DZaneSimon on Twitter. You can find Vic on Bloody Elbow in the moderators section, tearing shit up, or on Twitter at Vic M Rodriguez. And remember to like this video with the thumbs up. That's important if you're watching it on YouTube. And follow MMANation.com. And make sure to pay attention. We'll be back with the sixth round. I've got the MMA perspective later today. More videos, Knuckle Up next week, more vivisections, everything else. So check it out. Stay with us. Until next time.